Hi, everyone. This is Jason Rosenbaum, a political correspondent with St. Louis Public Radio. Late last month, I spent quite a bit of time talking with Lis Smith, a Democratic communications strategist who recently released Any Given Tuesday, a political love story. It's a vulnerable, thought-provoking, and often hilarious book about regional and national politics. Smith gained national prominence with her work on Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign in 2020, but she spent a bit of her career in Missouri. To start off, I asked Smith about the general reception for the book, which has become a New York Times bestseller.
Well, when you write a book for the first time, you have no idea how it's going to be received. But it has been really encouraging. Obviously, I was thrilled to make the New York Times bestseller list, but I've been thrilled with the response I've received from people. And when I set out to write this book, I didn't want just to write a very partisan book or even a super political book. I want to write a book that Democrats, Republicans, and apolitical people alike would take to. And I've been really heartened to see that that's been the case. And it's interesting. I have heard from staffers for some very, very high profile Republicans in Washington who said that they loved it, but I've also heard from a lot of my friends and friends of friends who aren't political at all that they loved it. So that's exactly what I was aiming for, and I'm really, really, really happy with the response.
If people are really into politics, they know you best from your work with Pete Buttigieg's 2020 campaign. But I got to know you in the mid to late 2000s because of your work in Missouri. So could you explain to our listeners what your connection to Missouri politics was and how you lived here for a few years?
Yes. So I moved to Missouri in September of 2005, and I was one of Claire McCaskill's first staffers on her U.S. Senate campaign against Jim Talent. And I started out, I didn't really have any sort of title. I was just a junior communications staffer. I also happened to be dating uh, Jeff Smith, who then was running for state senate St. St. Louis. And so he and I lived together for a few years, and I worked for Claire from September 2005 until November 2006 when she beat Jim Talent. So it was that was obviously an amazing experience. I assume we'll talk about that, but um, subsequent to that, I worked for Chris Koster when he switched parties. He was Republican state senator, switched parties when he was running for attorney general to run as a Democrat. And so I helped him do his party switch, and I worked for him for a few months after that. But that's the extent of my Missouri experience. But it was Claire's race was my first race in communications, and it plays a big role in my book.
I know you only mentioned the Koster switch in like one sentence in your book. And it makes sense because it was a short amount of time. But I think for people that were not there in 2007, I cannot emphasize enough how big of a deal that was, and also how difficult of an assignment it was for you, given how much blowback he got from Democrats. Now, in retrospect, like, is it the biggest thing to happen in Missouri politics ever? Clearly not. We had a governor resign 4 years ago. But can you just kind of talk about that experience before we delve more into the McCaskill talent race?
Yeah. So in 2007, Costa reached out to me. Chris Costa reached out to me because he was colleagues with Jeff Smith in the state senate, and he was planning on running for attorney general as a Republican, but he was a Republican who was increasingly out of step with his party, and was much more. He was much more moderate than the Missouri Republican Party, and the Missouri Republican Party over the last 20 years has gotten increasingly conservative, and has gone increasingly to the right. And so it would have been very difficult for him to get through a Republican primary. And it probably would have forced him to take positions that would have been very uncomfortable for him and that he wouldn't have been able to take. So he decided that the Republican Party was no longer his home and that he was going to switch to the Democratic Party. But in switching to the Democratic Party, right, he was then stepping into a Democratic primary for Attorney General that was filled with a number of prominent Democrats. Who was it? There was a
It
state
was
senator.
Margaret Donnelly, who's the state
Yeah.
representative, and also Jeff Harris,
Yeah.
who is the House Minority Leader, and also a fourth candidate, Molly Williams is her name.
Okay.
I can't remember what I did 10 minutes ago, but I can remember an obscure fourth place finisher from an attorney general's race. But continue.
Because I think she got in after I left the race, but so um, it was a massive story, right? When Koster switched parties, and I think people sort of figured out maybe what was going on when the media advisory for his party switch went out under my name, and I think you were the first reporter to call me about it, being like, what's going on here?
It was, yes, that was, I've mentioned this on Twitter like 7 times in the last 15 years. I'm always like, well, this is the anniversary of Chris Koster switching. And I knew it because Lis Smith was the person on it. And, the interesting thing was, like, I don't know if I dealt with you directly that much during the McCaskill campaign. I think I dealt with Adrian Marsh more on a day-to-day basis, but I definitely recognized your name because I think you were on all of the media advisories
Right.
for McCaskill. So that was a dead giveaway that something was up. And then I put like a blog post up mentioning you, and somebody called me right away. It was like, he's switching parties, like,
Right.
get ready for Koster Mageddon or something. But yeah, continue.
Right. But so I mean, it generated a ton of press, right? Locally. It even got, national press. I remember New York Times, Washington Post coming in to cover it, which doesn't happen every day in a Missouri attorney general race. But then as soon as he switched parties, yes, the incoming was swift, both from the right and the left. I know that Republicans felt like he had betrayed them, and the Republican consultants who had worked with him weren't pleased with it. But then Democrats were also peeved by it because they knew that he would be a formidable candidate, and that one, like the second he got in the race, right, he started to sort of set the pace for it. But two, that he really big-footed Jeff Harris and Margaret Donnelly, and that it was going to be tough for them to compete for attention. But yes, he did face attacks from both the right and the left, even before he officially announced that he was switching parties.
So the reason I kind of mentioned that and wanted to go into a little bit of detail is I think that there has been a debate among Missouri Democrats for a long time about whether they should field like candidates with somewhat moderate political beliefs like Koster. Like Koster, even after his party switch, was opposed to gun control and was generally like in line with Farm Bureau and other agriculture interests that are not really in line with the Democratic Party, or whether they should be like full-throated progressives who are championing their proponency of abortion rights and their proponency of gun control. This seems to be a debate that's going on in other states that have become more Republican, like Ohio, Florida. West Virginia used to be a Democratic state, is now like a super Republican state. I'd be interested in your take on whether either one of those like archetypes are the right one at this moment.
Well, it's hard to speak about it really in the abstract, because I think you and I both know that candidate quality matters a lot, and that it takes in a state like Missouri that has trended so hard toward the right and moved so far rightward since I've worked there. When I was in Missouri in 2006, it was still a swing state. And there's no, there's no one I know that would ever describe it as a swing state now. And I think a lot of people who are newer to presidential politics would be shocked to know that in 2000, 2004, 2008, that Democrats were fighting so hard to win that state in presidential elections. So, look, I think given the rightward shift in Missouri, it makes sense to have a Democrat that reflects the values of the voters there, which is going to be very different from a candidate who reflects the values of voters where I live in New York State. But if you have a good candidate who can connect with people, they can overcome having positions that maybe are more unpopular with the broader electorate. So it really, I'm not giving you a clear answer on it because it really depends on who the candidate is. But I've generally found, and this is something I write about in my book, that we need to the Democratic Party needs to give candidates the permission to break with the National Party on issues and to not expect every candidate to check every box on some sort of purity test list, and that there is no one way to be a Democrat. And especially if the Democratic Party wants to be a majority party and expand our majority in the US Senate, we've got to understand that there are going to be Democrats like Joe Manchin who hold vastly different positions from, a Democrat like Chuck Schumer, Kirsten Gillibrand. But that's okay. And more Democrats is better than fewer Democrats. And if you think you have a problem with a West Virginia Democrat, like, oh boy, wait till you see a West Virginia Republican.
Well, this kind of gets into your time with McCaskill in 2006, because when we talked with Senator McCaskill in actually 2013, when she first came on the Politically Speaking podcast, she said her biggest mistake in 2004 when she lost to Matt Blunt for governor was not taking the effort to reach rural voters seriously. And it's obvious in 2006, she did a lot better, because I don't think she would have won if she would have gotten her margins better. How do you think that she was able to do that from your vantage point in the campaign?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really important point. And it's one that Democrats can learn from everywhere. And we are actually seeing more Democrats put that into action in this cycle than we did really in the last couple cycles. A couple Democrats that I'd highlight are, Tim Ryan in Ohio, Beto O'Rourke in Texas is doing this, where they've realized what Claire did, which is that you can't just think that you'll win a state that is trending red or traditionally red by running up the margins in Democratic areas. So in Missouri, you can't just think you're going to win if you run up the margins in Kansas City, St. Louis, Columbia. That just doesn't work anymore. And it wouldn't have worked in 2006. So what Claire understood was that part of how you win is, yes, you try to run up the margins there, turn out Democratic voters in those places, but then cut into Republican margins in, outstate Missouri, in rural Missouri. So what that looks like is going to a county that maybe is traditionally 80-20 Republican and cutting the margin to 70-30, 60-40, 55-45, whatever it is. And knowing that you're not going to the county because you're going to win it, But that if you go to enough of these counties and you cut into the Republican margin enough, then that's going to add up, and that's going to be what will put you over the edge to win. And there, Democrats have gotten a little bit away from that strategy. And frankly, it's the strategy that Barack Obama used to win states like Indiana in 2008, to win states like Ohio in 2008 and 2012. Because he understood that it's not just about, running up the score with the base, it's about persuasion. And again, going back to what I said earlier, if Democrats want to be a majority party, we have got to be a party of persuasion, a party that goes everywhere and is willing to talk to rural voters, not because we think we're going to win the rural vote, but we can win enough rural voters to help us win elections.
One of the challenges you talk about in this book is McCaskill's opponent, who at the time was Jim Talent. And unlike a lot of Republican incumbents that year, he didn't really have like a really obvious weakness. There were candidates that cycle that were, under legal trouble, like Conrad Burns in Montana, or that made gaffes like George Allen in Virginia. How did the campaign try to find a weakness with Talent?
Right. Well, we knew that we were not going to be able to portray him as some like villainous goon, some heartless, corrupt Republican. And Claire was pretty explicit when she would do interviews or when she'd go out and hit the stump and talk with voters. She would say, look, I think Jim Talent is a nice guy. I think Senator Talent's a nice guy. But the problem is that he's not on your side. And on important issue after important issue, he sold out the people of Missouri. And I'm going to go to Washington to be an advocate for you. And so what we made it about was not a character attack on Jim Talent. And, a lot of races are decided by debates over candidates' characters. What we made it was we turned it into a debate over his priorities and his policies, because we understood that we would never be able to portray him as this villain. And it ended up being extremely effective because one, it was credible. Voters can smell BS, right? They can tell if you're selling them a bill of goods and it doesn't comport with reality. But two is that Jim Talent had embraced a number of policies that were really unpopular with the people of Missouri, and that allowed us to portray him as out of touch, whether it was on healthcare policies, economic policies, foreign policy. And ultimately, that's why people went with Claire, because she combined a message with tactics that showed her as the candidate who was better in touch with Missourians, whether they lived in St. Louis, Kansas City, Columbia, or lived in, outstate.
The other thing that you mentioned that often is forgotten now because it's just not as big of an issue is the stem cell amendment. One of the parts in your book that I found to be like a really well-written foreshadowing element was the fact that you staffed Michael J. Fox before his first interview with my former colleague, Joe Maness. Can you talk about that moment? Because not only was it a memorable moment in your political career, but it also showcased something in your personal life that would become much more relevant to you.
That's one of those moments in a campaign where you don't realize, when you're driving over, when I was driving over to the hotel to, staff Michael J. Fox for interviews, I didn't realize that this was going to be like a watershed moment in the campaign, that this was going to be massive in the campaign. So for people who aren't necessarily familiar with the ins and outs of that campaign and why Michael J. Fox played such a big role in it was, in addition to Claire being on the ballot in 2006, there was an amendment on the ballot to legalize stem cell research. And it was a very, very contentious issue. And I think that the ballot initiative ended up being a closer race than the US Senate race, or it was
I think it ended up passing like 51-48. Obviously, those numbers don't equal 100, but it was very close. And it was notable it was that close because the opposition did not have nearly as much money.
It was the political fault lines that developed around it were fascinating too, because it wasn't just right versus left. In the Republican Party, there was a big split. Then Republican Governor Matt Blunt supported the amendment, whereas Jim Talent, we sort of backed him into a corner, and he ended up opposing the amendment, casting his lot with the religious conservatives who opposed it. And that was a sort of a surprising development. We weren't really sure where he was going to land on that debate, but it gave us a very clear contrast to run with in the campaign. So that all is a backdrop for why Michael J. Fox came to Missouri, because Michael J. Fox is a huge advocate for stem cell research. Just I think 7 years prior, he had sort of stunned the world. I think it was 6 or 7 years prior, he had stunned the world with the announcement that he had Parkinson's disease. And he spent a lot of time going out and campaigning for healthcare initiatives, any sort of potential for a cure like stem cell research that could help unlock a cure for Parkinson's. And I remember when I showed up, and I think he had about 4 back-to-back interviews. I was absolutely shocked at the severity of his symptoms of Parkinson's. And I had seen other people with Parkinson's up close, but I think it was really jarring seeing someone who you sort of associated with being this very boyish American icon, just really physically struggling with all of the debilitating symptoms that come along with Parkinson's. And it was very hard to watch up close. And I talk about how in the first interview, when he sat down with Joe Manis, because I think his nerves, exacerbated some of the symptoms, that I sort of hid my face and wiped away a tear because it was so hard to watch. And so, politically, it ended up being a very big deal, because when he was in town for Claire, he, in addition to doing those interviews, he cut an ad for her that we premiered during the World Series when the Cardinals were playing Detroit Tigers. I just
right. That was the year they weren't really that good, but they won the World Series anyways.
Exactly. But and we knew that it was a really, really powerful ad. And it was one of those ads where there are no bells and whistles. It was just Michael J. Fox direct to camera, speaking very stark language about what was at stake in the Senate race. And you had a choice between Claire McCaskill, who supported life-saving cures, and Jim Talent. And so we saved it to premiere during the World Series, and it was like a nuclear bomb when we dropped it, because it did undermine one of Jim Talent's core strengths, right? Because yes, it was about policy, but it did get to his character a little bit, because how could any good, decent person oppose a cure for something as debilitating as Michael J. Fox's Parkinson's? And that was sort of the backdrop to the language in the ad, was leaving viewers wondering and asking that question. And it led to this just massive political firestorm, where you had Rush Limbaugh then go out on his radio show that was live streamed to the web and saying, he went and said that Michael J. Fox was exaggerating the symptoms of his disease for show. And that's when I remember Joe Manis at the time being like, actually, when I interviewed him, his symptoms were worse than I saw in the ad. And, it ended up that Rush Limbaugh had to apologize for it. It was something that, Jim Talent had to answer for. And we saw Michael J. Fox replicate the ad for Democrats across the country because it was seen as being so effective. It did also have the effect of galvanizing the religious conservatives. And that's a fairly big voting block in Missouri. But then, on a personal level, I didn't know this at the time, but, it was obviously it was really emotional, really difficult seeing Michael J. Fox up close and the debilitating symptoms of his disease. But then 5 years later, my dad would get diagnosed with Parkinson's. And ultimately, I closed my book with this in almost a year ago. In September of 2021, he passed away from complications of Parkinson's disease. So it was sort of foreshadowing for personal challenges that I would face. But it allowed me to see what Parkinson's did to someone up close before my dad ultimately got diagnosed with it.
She ended up winning against Jim Talent, and she won another term in 2012 against Todd Akin before losing to Josh Hawley in 2018. And I think that McCaskill basically extended the lifespan of the Missouri Democratic Party probably for another 6 years because she won in 2012. But I'd be interested to hear, what do you think her overall impact is, not only on Missouri politics, but national politics in general? It does seem like she made an impact, especially in Missouri.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. She was sort of a giant in Missouri politics and did, the 2012 race was a very difficult race and by no means, a gimme. And I think there was that really, really unfortunate comment that Todd Akin made. What did he say? He said that
He said, if it's a legitimate rape, the
right.
body has a way of shutting the whole thing down. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but
that's how I remembered the comment. And that's again, Claire oftentimes, it's sort of interesting. She oftentimes found herself, whether it was in 2006 with the stem cell issue and Michael J. Fox ad, or in 2012 with Todd Akin and that comment, she found herself sort of, her race is getting extremely nationalized, but in the middle of these national firestorms, because in 2012, I was on, I wasn't in Missouri. I was working for Barack Obama as his director of rapid response in his Chicago headquarters. And I remember when we saw that clip, we knew that it would have ramifications, not just in the Missouri Senate race. I mean, when we saw that, we were like, okay, well, this probably means that, Claire's chances of winning just went up significantly. But we took it in Chicago and we made sure that every Republican across the country had to answer for those comments, and including Mitt Romney, and that what happened in Missouri didn't just stay in Missouri. And subsequently, you had another candidate that cycle, Richard Murdoch in Indiana, who had a similar moment in a debate where he described a pregnancy from rape as a gift from God. And again, it was another comment that we made sure that every Republican across the country had to answer for. And it was a comment that helped elect Joe Donnelly as a senator from Indiana, because, even though Indiana also is a more conservative state, certainly more socially conservative, and you have a big population there of religious conservatives, it was a bridge too far for voters there as well. So So she found herself in both 2006 and 2012 in the middle of these national firestorms, and helped, whether intentional or not, it gave Democrats, really issues to help tie Republicans to. And she also had developed a really distinct brand for herself in Washington as a Democrat who, as you sort of open this interview with, could appeal to rural voters. And she was someone who, when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, she sort of served as one, she was a key endorser for him. She was the first woman US Senator to endorse him, but also made sure that when he was doing outreach, that he didn't forget rural voters, and that he spoke in a language that they would understand. Because sometimes, as Democrats, we can sometimes gravitate toward language that people might identify as stereotypically coastal, elitist, whatever. I remember Obama got in trouble for something he said about arugula or something like that. But Claire served as like a ballast for him, and someone who would tell him when when he was sounding a little out of touch and elitist. And so played a really big role in that campaign, was a very big endorser for him, and a really big validator, because Hillary Clinton was as Hillary Clinton leaned increasingly into her historic status as potentially the first, woman nominee from a major party. Claire was a major validator for Barack Obama. So she is someone who, and I could go on even longer, but I think that gives you a sense of the role that she played both in Missouri and in national politics. And that's why I think she still is so prominent as a commentator on MSNBC, but someone that the national press goes to, because she's got a lot of credibility as a messenger who can appeal to voters, both blue and red.
We'll be right back after this short break with more from Lis Smith. So you talked about how you were the director of rapid response for Barack Obama. And I want to read you a passage from the segment of your book where you talk about that. It felt like campaign reporters wanted the prestige of working at marquee publications without doing any of the hard gumshoe reporting of their predecessors. In earlier presidential cycles, the reporters that covered campaigns were hardened veterans, or at the very least, people who had spent several years cutting their teeth in less glamorous gigs in state capitals and city halls across the country. There's not much glory in filing dozens of public information requests to get to the bottom of sketchy construction contracts in Youngstown, Ohio, or taking 2 years to report on the self-dealing practices of a small town sheriff in Nevada. Now, I'll admit, when I read that, that hit a little close to home, because when I started at the Columbia Tribune, I was 22. Now, granted, I was not doing what you were mentioning, which is like following around presidential campaigns. But I do kind of understand what you're saying there, but I kind of want you to elaborate on that, because I do think that has been a shift in political reporting over the last 10 to 15 years.
Well, of course. And I'm not, my point there isn't to say 22-year-olds shouldn't be reporters. I mean, obviously, you've got to start somewhere. And I'm sure that 22-year-old Jason Rosenbaum was just one heck of a gumshoe reporter.
I made my fair share of mistakes, but I'll let you keep going before I start like going into a nostalgic wormhole.
But I think what I was trying to get at there was the flawed model for presidential coverage. And it's one thing to be a 22-year-old reporter were you at the Columbia Daily Tribune?
Yes, which had like a circulation of 25,000 at the time. So this was not okay. I want to make it clear. I kind of made it clear in my tongue-in-cheek comment. This is not the same as following around, Barack Obama or John McCain everywhere. It was working at a regional newspaper. But it
Right.
was notable because since Missouri was a swing state, I went to tons of presidential events that year. So it was kind of like I was covering the presidential race whenever Missouri was important at a particular point in time.
So what I talk about is how there's been a shift in the model of how major news organizations, major national news organizations, cover presidential races, and it's a shift that I think uh, does a disservice to news consumers, and that does benefit the campaigns and the people who are trying to spin on behalf of campaigns. And because now what you've seen is, and in 2012, I talk about this dynamic, was that New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, NBC, ABC, CBS, instead of having sort of hardened veterans covering the presidential race, they shifted to a model of having, 22, 23, 24-year-old, fresh out of college or J school reporters who could just essentially just really just churn out copy very quickly for less money. And having them follow around presidential candidates. And the problem with this model is that if you are 22, 23, 24 years old, it's going to be harder for you to really stand up to a presidential candidate and a presidential candidate's staff, because you just haven't been in the business long enough, and it's easier for them to try to railroad you and try to say, if you write, anything that's at all critical of our campaign, then we'll just cut off access for you. And it creates sort of a Stockholm syndrome dynamic. It was actually, I think, David Axelrod who described it as a Stockholm syndrome dynamic, where the reporters end up being sort of identifying with the candidates they cover and being sort of dependent on them. So rather than speaking truth to power, the incentive for them is to just sort of, go along with the candidates and their campaigns and their staffers, rather than rocking the boat. Because if you rock the boat, then you risk, sort of being alienated and being cut out from getting any scoops or anything like that. So it's a really unhealthy dynamic that then essentially reduces the embeds, as we call them, the people who are on the plane with presidential candidates. It reduces the embeds to glorified stenographers, and it takes away their incentive to challenge these presidential candidates. And isn't really that what you want? You want reporters who will vet these candidates, who aren't afraid when they have a moment to ask a question, who aren't afraid to ask a really tough question. And the system that we have now with the embed system with major news publications has really disincentivized that.
Did you see this trend continue in 2020 when you worked for Pete Buttigieg?
What was interesting about 2020 is you had over 20 something candidates on the Democratic side. So their news outlets are going to be spread extremely, extremely thin. And on the Democratic side, in terms of campaigns who had embeds, you had the Biden campaign, you had Pete's campaign, you had Kamala Harris's campaign, you had Bernie Sanders' campaign, you had Elizabeth Warren's campaign. And then, so news outlets had to devote so many resources there, and reporters were spread even more thin. And I would say that I was really impressed by the quality of the embeds who covered Pete's campaign. And we gave them, it was a different dynamic, frankly, than we saw with Romney in 2012, because one gamble that we made was that we would give reporters access no matter what. And it was sort of that access was the key to Pete succeeding. So reporters who covered Pete faced completely different dynamics from the reporters who covered Romney. And there was no disincentive to ask Pete a tough question, because we weren't going to punish reporters and say, oh, you don't get to cover him or you're off the bus, because we knew that access was the name of the game and that would be how Pete would succeed. So I would say it was a little bit of a different dynamic, but yeah, issues with the embed system do persist. And I don't know, frankly, that it's going to be a bell that can be unrung by news organizations, because it's now a part of the system. And as long as there is some sort of counterbalance, some counterweight, where you do have, more veteran reporters go out occasionally or serve as, backstops with the embeds, there are ways that you can make the embed system work better.
Now, before I launch into a couple of Buttigieg related questions, can you just explain what your role in that campaign was?
Yeah, so it was it's hard to say, because it's sort of like not really a traditional role in presidential politics, but I was technically a senior advisor in communications. I was his first staffer on his presidential race. I'd worked with him. I'd first met him in December of 2016, when he called me because he was looking to run for DNC chair. And there was a big DNC chair race in February of 2017. And so he ended up throwing his hat in the ring. And I just found him to be so unique and such a unique communicator, a breath of fresh air, someone who had a completely different profile from other people in national Democratic politics, and certainly anyone who was thinking about running for president. When he announced for president, he was 37-year-old mayor of the town of South Bend, Indiana. He was openly gay. He was Navy veteran. He was a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. And so had a really, really compelling biography. And on top of all of that, he was a Rhodes Scholar who speaks, a gazillion languages. So certainly not the type of candidate that you see every day. And so I had worked with him for a couple years before he threw his hat in the ring for president. He officially announced his exploratory committee in late January of 2019. But my role with him was, I was senior advisor for communications. I was one of his first staffers, and I helped really craft his media strategy going into the race. And, throughout the campaign, I oversaw his earned media strategy. I ran his debate prep, and, I came up with ideas like his all access bus tour that tried to replicate John McCain's bus tour in the 2000 presidential campaign, the Straight Talk Express. So I oversaw all of his earned media strategy. But one thing that was really critical to Pete's rise was, he had no money when he announced for president. He had no big national fundraising base. Again, he's the mayor of South Bend. He had no national name ID. And on top of that, his last name was this seemingly impossible to pronounce Maltese.
It took a while for me to figure it out. We have weird names in Missouri, like Luke DeMeyer and Schaefer Cotter. So I think I'm used to strange sounding German names, but Buttigieg, which I think is Maltese.
Yes, Maltese. Yeah.
It took a couple of tries, and I probably had to go on YouTube and see him speak his own name before I got it right.
Yeah. And so I assume we'll get more into this, but essentially we knew that he didn't have a lot of the advantages that a lot of presidential candidates have when they announce, and that his only path, and it was a narrow path, but his only path to catching fire with voters was going to be through the earned media, because that's not contingent on money or name ID. It just is, everyone has access to the press, and it's just a question of whether you can be compelling in the press. And I knew that Pete would be able to be. So, and so we adopted a strategy of really going everywhere and saying yes to a lot of interviews that most political candidates and certainly most presidential candidates would have said no to. In interviews with non-traditional outlets, non-political outlets that other campaigns would have said, well, what's the point? And that's how Pete really caught fire, because he is an incredibly talented communicator. And we made it so that it was pretty hard to not hear from him.
So you alluded to this earlier, but his campaign was historic because he was the most viable candidate who was openly gay in modern political history.
Yeah.
I'm curious how often reporters wanted to hone in on that fact, because in my experience of covering openly gay politicians in Missouri, they either embrace that role because they need to be a communicator to defend LGBTQ rights, or they're asked about every conceivable issue that hits that sphere, and you could tell that they become very irritated by that and want to talk about other things. I'd be interested about what that dynamic was with Buttigieg, given that that was probably one of the things that people wanted to talk about a lot.
Yeah, and for him, it was not something that bothered him to talk about or something that he was uncomfortable about, because he and his husband was a very, very visible surrogate for the campaign, and ended up being sort of like a rock star in his own right, and someone that we could send out to do fundraisers for Pete, to do interviews for Pete, to stump for Pete. And so Pete's identity as, one of the first major openly gay candidates in American history was not something we shied away from, because we understood that it was an asset, and it was something that brought more attention to the campaign, that brought a lot of energy to the campaign, because it was, a historic moment. So it was something that reporters did want to talk about, but it was something that Pete was more than happy to engage in. And frankly, it brought a lot of energy to the campaign, and some of the big moments, right? Like when he and Chasten were featured on the cover of Time magazine. It was a moment that we had a lot of Pete's, LGBTQ supporters come up and say was something that they never thought they'd see in their lifetimes. And so it was something that we really tried to hone the energy around it. And yes, the press did want to talk about it, but I think Pete was more than happy to talk about it. And at a certain point, though, it sort of almost became normalized. And because Pete didn't try to hide the ball on it, he didn't try to play coy about it. I mean, he and Chasten campaigned in a very transparent, open way. And what I think was really heartening about that was, by the end of the campaign, that those questions about his sexuality and all that, it almost never came up anymore, and it was almost like it was completely normalized. And I hope that for campaigns going forward, certainly presidential campaigns going forward, that he reduced the exotic nature of it, and makes it easier and has made it easier for openly LGBTQ candidates to run for office.
So Buttigieg did not end up winning the nomination, but he obviously became so well known that he is now transportation secretary. So I would make the argument that the strategy of going anywhere had some elements of success to it. But the person that ended up winning the nomination, Joe Biden, I don't think was on Barstool or Fox News or TMZ. And you could make an argument, well, he did the opposite thing and he's president of the United States right now.
Yeah. So it all depends on the campaign. It all depends on the candidate. And it's not a strategy that would have worked for Joe Biden. And going back to, I think, your first question about, well, what type of Democrat should Democrats nominate in Missouri going forward? And there's no like one size fits all way to campaign or way to be a candidate. And the go everywhere strategy worked for Pete because he is really quick on his feet. He is really good in interviews. He always has something interesting and fresh to say. But it was also our only path to getting well known. So it was a strategy that played to his strengths, but is also a strategy of necessity. With Biden had 100% name ID when he entered the presidential race. He did not need to go everywhere to make himself known. And he was someone who was a really, really respected figure in the Democratic Party. And, there's a lot more downside sometimes to, opening yourself up to non-traditional interviews. And so it wouldn't have made sense for him as a strategy. And I'm not saying that it's a strategy that every candidate across the country should embrace. It just happened to be an innovative strategy, a sort of bold strategy that worked really, really well for Pete. And it's one that I've seen more and more younger candidates embrace. Because I think that, younger candidates do understand the increasingly fractured nature of media consumption and the changing nature of how people consume their news, because, that's them. They don't consume news just by reading the front page of, the New York Times or watching cable news or anything like that. No, they get their news from non-traditional news sources. And so they understand that it's important to go and reach out to people and meet them where they are. And oftentimes that is going outside of the, traditional legacy media. And being willing to have some fun with it, and going on sports outlets, entertainment outlets, and talking more about pop culture, or I don't know, whatever the news of the day is with the NFL or whatever it is. And that oftentimes that's a more effective way to reach voters than doing the traditional political interviews, which, as we know, with a lot of these outlets, that their audiences are shrinking rather than growing.
So how much of a tonal shift was it for you to be a part of this widely praised campaign for Pete Buttigieg in 2020? And then in 2021, you're in the behind the scenes mix when Andrew Cuomo was going down in flames.
Oh yeah. I mean, not even a tonal shift. I mean, it was a total shift. And Andrew's someone who I'd worked for in 2018 on his, I'd consulted for him on his gubernatorial reelection. And I remember at the time in 2018, I was also consulting for Pete on his political endeavors. And he was traveling the country, speaking at Democratic dinners. And he had a PAC that he used to raise money for Democratic candidates across the country. And at the time, it was very jarring, because there'd be days I'd be in New York, and I worked out of Cuomo's New York City office, and I didn't like travel with him when he would campaign. But I was a top advisor there, and I would give him advice, and his style was very much brass knuckles against his, he had a primary opponent in Cynthia Nixon, who is the Sex and the City actress, but someone who had also been very active in New York politics. And then he had a general election, and, Cuomo's style is very much, hammer, everything is nail and he's a hammer. Whereas Pete has a very different style, which is, you don't hear him engaging in a ton of over the top negative rhetoric. And his view on politics is that it's a game of addition, not subtraction. And you've got to give people permission to come along with you. And that was one of the reasons why he did so well in the presidential campaign, and especially in red areas, because he didn't go out and he had a line where he said that, your vote in the last presidential race doesn't define you, and sort of to give people permission to come over and vote for this 37-year-old openly gay Democrat, and people who'd been, Republicans forever. So I for a couple years I dealt with this sort of tonal discordance, but then yeah, there was um, just the experience of everything with Pete was so inspiring, even though he didn't win. And it really showed the best, I think, of American politics. He ran an incredibly inspiring, uplifting campaign that was based on, again, bringing people over to his side, not attacking the opposition. Um, sure, he drew contrasts. Whereas with uh, Andrew Cuomo, he called me and asked if I would help give him advice when he was facing um, uh, allegations of sexual harassment. And then he ended up just crashing and burning. And, within the course of a year, he had gone from being seen as this like national hero who'd done these masterful COVID briefings to resigning
Yeah.
and resigning in disgrace. And so it was to say it was like whiplash, it was an understatement. And it gets to sort of one thing I wanted to talk about in my book, and it gets to my title, Any Given Tuesday, which is that like on any given Tuesday, you can like, be working for someone like Pete Buttigieg, but then the next Tuesday you're working for someone like Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
and I
and
and I, wa- I wanted to get on that because I think this book has been widely praised. Okay, but if you've gotten any criticism, it's been by people who are like, "How could you possibly try to help somebody like Andrew Cuomo, who
yeah,
is accused of very serious sexual misconduct?" And they're just sort of befuddled, like why you would be involved in this, dude. And I just want to provide some context here why I'm asking you this question. In Missouri in 2018, you had a very similar situation happen with Eric Greitens. And a lot of people that worked for him, both on a political side and on an official side, kind of became embarrassed to work for him and, probably didn't want to stick with him when he was going down in flames. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on why you did what you did.
yeah. And there was definitely a personal element to it. One thing I talk about in my book is how in 2013, I went in December of 2013, I went from sort of being a staffer who helped shape stories to becoming a story myself. And that was, I was working for the incoming mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, on his transition. And I was going to be, his chief spokeswoman in City Hall. But then the New York Post broke that I was dating Elliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York, who'd been a bit scandal tarred himself. He'd had to resign, and he's someone that I had consulted for months earlier. And I became a target in the tabloids. Bill de Blasio completely, threw me under the bus, fired me. And it was a really, really tough, alienating, isolating moment where I just saw sort of the underbelly of politics, which is that like all these people who had been there and been my best friends and greatest friends when everything was going well for me, they were suddenly nowhere to be found when I'm in the middle of this firestorm. And, I lost friends over it. I lost, it strained relationships with people who I'd considered trusted colleagues. I lost a job over it. And, I'd always sort of, after that moment, wanted to be the person who wasn't like a cut and run artist, who wasn't like a typical political climber, someone who was just there for people in their best moments and not there for them in their worst moments. And it really showed me just sort of an ugly side of politics. And to me, then going forward, I wanted to be the type of person that would be there for you even in your lowest moments. And so when Andrew Cuomo called me, he had been accused of sexual harassment by one former staffer. And this was in, I think, March of 2021. He vigorously denied what he was accused of. And promised to me and to other staffers that nothing else would come out. And so I thought it was important then to be there for him and to advise him and to not just abandon him, because it made no sense to me that he would lie to the people advising him, right? That does it, you know, if you want the best advice from people like me, and in anything having to do with crisis communications, you've got to be honest with the people advising you so that they know what can come out. But it taught me an important lesson, which is that I had maybe taken the wrong lesson from my own experience, where I viewed loyalty as the ultimate form of integrity. And I didn't realize that, you know, that there are different types of loyalty. There's earned loyalty, but there's also blind loyalty. And I think what I was exhibiting with Andrew Cuomo was more blind loyalty, where I was just going along with him because I thought loyalty mattered more than anything else. But another thing I learned about loyalty too is that it's got to be a two-way street. And essentially, he was asking people like me and, you know, a dozen other people to to give up our time to advise him, to put our reputations on the line. But did he care about us at all and what the fallout would be for us? No. And so sometimes in politics, staffers go out and they do put themselves on the line for politicians and learn the hard way that like the politicians don't really care about them and that the loyalty doesn't go both ways.
You know, yesterday I saw a tweet from him that he still thinks that he didn't do anything wrong. And, you know, he seems to want to still get back into the mix. Is he just delusional? Like,
Yeah.
or do you think that he didn't do anything wrong?
No, I don't think that you can have that many sort of allegations of and certainly like with Greitens, right? Andrew, let's just be very clear. Andrew Cuomo was not accused of anything like that, right? The Greitens stuff was horrifying, but like with it would stretch credulity to think that you have these 11 allegations of sexual harassment, and that there's not an element of truth to them. It's not just 1, 2, 3, or even 4, and at some point there's a pattern that's established, and I think that there was clearly a pattern that was established in the Attorney General's report. And for me, what was a major red flag was that it was not something that Governor Cuomo was forthcoming with his staff about. And even after he'd sat down with the Attorney General for her report, he continued to lie to the people around him and say, nothing else is going to come out. Nothing else is going to come out. And I just don't think that those are the actions of an innocent person.
I want to ask you a final few bits of questions that you can answer as shortly or as verbosely as possible. Some of them are on like modern day political some of these are on modern day political I can't say that word.
Prognostication.
Others are a little bit more fun. So should Democrats be worried that Ron DeSantis is going to overtake Trump and is going to be a much more formidable candidate against Joe Biden or whoever is the Democratic nominee?
No, I think that DeSantis is sort of the flavor of the moment, but I think that he's very, very overrated. He's someone whose political skills are questionable. I know he's someone who doesn't play well with others, but also isn't great at the glad-handing aspect of politics. It is pretty awkward interpersonally. I also think that he has a very narrow sort of appeal, and it's similar to Trump's appeal, right? And similar to Chris Christie's appeal before, which is that what he's going out and saying to the Republican base is that, those people you hate, I hate them even more than you do. And with Christie, it was, the teachers, public employees. With Trump, it was immigrants, and with DeSantis, it seems to be the public health experts. But I am not someone who buys into the DeSantis hype.
If Joe Biden does not run for another term, would Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker be a more successful version of Michael Bloomberg in that she would be able to self-fund, but not look like a complete doofus doing it?
I think that, I think that Pritzker is a more talented politician than Bloomberg, and is someone who, is more in touch with the Democratic base than Mike Bloomberg is.
Does Pete Buttigieg like living in Michigan more than he likes living in Indiana? Because I know he moved to Michigan because his husband's family lives in Traverse City. I may be pronouncing the name of that city right. Yeah. So there's an actual reason for him to do it. I know that like people are like, well, he's moving to Michigan because it's a more democratic state and he wants to like run there. But
I've never asked him that question, so I don't feel comfortable answering on his behalf. But I think he loves both places. And he wrote a post on Medium over the weekend where for the first time he talked about the challenging first.
I read it. It was an unbelievable thing to read. Like my kids have never had health challenges like his kids have had, but regardless of your political belief or your view of Buttigieg, you should read it.
Right. And it shed some light, because I think a lot of people, when he moved to Michigan, were sort of viewing it through a political lens. And obviously, I knew the backstory there, right? But it for them, with all the health challenges they had with their twins, it made sense for them to have a place where they could have, childcare via Chasten's parents, and it makes their lives a lot easier.
Taking out St. Louis and Kansas City, what was your favorite place to visit when you lived in Missouri?
I liked going to some towns like Hannibal was cool to visit because it's really picturesque. I did like going to Columbia. They had great restaurants there and bars, and that was a fun place to visit as well. But I liked visiting, smaller towns like St. Joe and Hannibal. And Hannibal sticks out because it wasn't too far from St. Louis, and it obviously has a lot of historical significance.
What is your favorite song off the seminal Guns N' Roses album, Chinese Democracy?
Oh my God, that's brutal, dude. That is brutal. It's one of the I see Guns N' Roses whenever they go on tour now, and like I think if we're gonna be honest with each other, that's probably the least stimulating part.
No, I'm gonna stop you there. I am a Chinese Democracy truther. I think it's legitimately a good album. It is not disappointing at all. And the best song is the title track, in my opinion. But
I would say Chinese Democracy. So the ones that they play live, it's Chinese Democracy. They play the blues. And I think there's one other song that they always play live from Chinese Democracy.
Might be IRS, Catcher in the Rye.
I have never met anyone before who loves Chinese Democracy. So I'm very impressed by your commitment to it. But I listened to it all the time when it first came out, and I tried so hard because I love Guns N' Roses. I'm a true fan of theirs. I love
Axl. Okay, I'll redirect the question. What's just your favorite Guns N' Roses song? And then I'll give you mine, and then we'll part ways.
Estranged.
Yes, that is my favorite one too.
Really?
Yes.
It's so good.
I think it is better than November Rain. November Rain is obviously the more popular long song off of Use Your Illusions. It's such a great song.
Such a great song.
Well, Liz, thank you so much for talking with me. And if people want to know more about buying this book, obviously they can go to Amazon and type in the title, but is there any other thing you would want to like direct the listeners to learn more about you or the book?
No, I would just encourage them. You go to it's on sale at your local bookstores, and certainly the bigger websites like Amazon, Barnes and Noble. But I would encourage people to read the book because one, it's I think it's a pretty quick read, but it's something where you can learn a lot about politics, because one thing that I thought was really important was to demystify politics, because it is still an industry that is still opaque to so many people. So I would encourage everyone to go out and pick up a copy of Any Given Tuesday, whether it's from your local library or local bookstore.
You can read all of St. Louis Public Radio's political coverage at stlpr.org. I'm Jason Rosenbaum, and thank you for listening.